the chain of a woman's happiness. When he was 25, Lincoln decided to run for the legislature one more time as a member of the Whig Party. This time, he was better known in Illinois. He won and served 8 years in the Illinois General Assembly. As a legislator, Lincoln finally seemed to have found himself. He was quick and witty in debate and skilled at party politics. It was in the Illinois legislature that Lincoln made his first public statement in protest of slavery, calling it both unjust and bad policy. Membership in a state legislature was only a part-time job, and not one that paid very well. So Lincoln decided simultaneously to become a lawyer. He did this, like everything else in life, through his own initiative in studying. He borrowed all the law books he could and studied them until he felt he understood their principles. His advice to law students later was, always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing. When he was 27, he earned his license and moved to the state capital of Springfield to join the law practice of his friend John Stuart. Stuart once described his first impressions of Lincoln. He was the most uncouth-looking young man I ever saw. He seemed to have little to say, seemed to feel timid, with a tinge of sadness visible in the countenance. But when he did talk, all this disappeared for a time, and he demonstrated that he was both strong and acute. One of Lincoln's most famous law cases was one he discredited a witness who claimed he'd seen Lincoln's client committing a murder by the light of the moon. Lincoln produced an almanac that proved there was no moon the night of the murder, and his client was acquitted. Lincoln changed law firms a few times and finally settled down with a partner, William Herndon. He never dissolved that partnership, even when he was president. At his request, the sign above the office still read Lincoln and Herndon, even when Lincoln was in the White House. While living in Springfield, Lincoln began courting Mary Todd, a Kentucky woman to whom he'd soon proposed. It was a turbulent relationship from the start. Mary was high-strung and socially ambitious. Lincoln was introspective and given to moods. Lincoln broke off the engagement at one point, sure they wouldn't be able to make each other happy. But he was so depressed after this, an event he always referred to as that fatal 1st of January, that they reconciled soon after. The two finally married in 1842, when Lincoln was 33 and Mary was 23. It was a loving marriage and a devoted one, in spite of persistent troubles and challenges that increased dramatically during the White House years. Lincoln had regular episodes of melancholy, and Mary had a series of nervous fits and breakdowns. She occasionally had tantrums of jealousy and a temper that embarrassed Lincoln in public, and she spent their money so lavishly that her husband was often driven into debt. Mary was an unhappy First Lady. Her brothers were serving in the Confederate Army while her husband was commanding the Union, and as a result she was considered a traitor by some of the public and press. She also grew desperately lonely when Lincoln was forced to travel. After the death of one of their children, and after she witnessed her husband's assassination, she went insane and was admitted to a mental institution. The Lincolns had 4 children, all boys, but only one, Robert, would live to adulthood. Edward died at age 4, years before Lincoln became president. Willie died in the White House at age 11, and Tad died at age 18, a few years after Lincoln was killed. When Lincoln was 38, he ran for and won a seat in Congress, still as a member of the Whig Party. When his term was up, he returned to Springfield and took up his law practice with renewed vigor. By the 1850s, he was one of the leading lawyers in Illinois. He might have continued as a lawyer, and he might have never left Illinois, except for a sudden change in the national policy toward slavery that lured him once again into politics. The change was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, an earlier bill that prohibited slavery in new territories. The new bill allowed settlers in the territories to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. It had been introduced by a senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln was outraged. Although not an abolitionist, he was strongly opposed to the further spread of slavery. Slavery, he said, was in violation of the American principles of equality and freedom. It will enable enemies of the free world to, in his words, taunt us as hypocrites. Determined to stop the new bill, Lincoln spearheaded a movement against Stephen Douglas and other politicians who supported it. When his own party, the Whigs, seemed split on the issue of slavery, he joined the Republican Party, an anti-slavery party only 2 years old. Then he accepted that party's nomination to run against Douglas for the U.S. Senate. His acceptance speech, given in 1858 when he was 49 years old, contains some of his most stirring and famous words. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Lincoln challenged his opponents to a series of debates, a series that made history for the way it gave prominence to the issue of slavery, and for how it brought national attention to Abraham Lincoln. Large crowds gathered for the debates, and the newspapers covered them with bold headlines. They were a colorful pair of opponents. Douglas, 5 feet 4 inches tall, smooth and polished, with a husky, well-trained voice, and Lincoln, nicknamed the Rail Splitter, a full foot taller with his earthy backwoods manners, a stride like a plowman, and a voice with a high-pitched twang. But it was more than Douglas versus Lincoln. It was slavery versus freedom. Lincoln lost the debates, and he lost the election. But he won something much larger. He had won the attention of the nation and of the Republican Party. In 1860, when he was 52 years old, they gave him the nomination for the presidency of the United States. In the 1800s, it was considered undignified for a candidate to do his own campaigning, so Lincoln sat back and watched while his followers did it for him. Their work was made somewhat easier by the fact that the Democrat Party split into two factions which competed against each other. In the end, Lincoln won all the electoral votes needed to put him in office, but more Americans voted against Lincoln than for him, and he lost the popular vote. Nearly all of Lincoln's popular and electoral votes came from the North. When he took the oath of office of President of the United States, it was already a nation divided. The first state to secede from the Union was South Carolina. It was followed quickly by 6 others, then 4 more. The Confederate States of America had been born, and for the first time in 100 years, the future of the Union was in doubt. In Charleston Harbor, in South Carolina, there was a fort that soon became a symbol to the American people of the sanctity of the Union. After Lincoln took office, the South seized federal forts within their borders and left Lincoln with some difficult decisions. Should he reclaim the forts? Should he strengthen the forts that hadn't been taken, like Fort Sumter? He knew that if he reinforced Fort Sumter, the South would consider it an act of war. Yet if he didn't, the North would protest. As a compromise, Lincoln decided to send just provisions to the fort, first informing the South of his intentions. The compromise didn't work. The South attacked, the fort surrendered, the Civil War had begun. The Civil War was the soul-consuming business of the entire presidency of Abraham Lincoln. It was a crisis of such enormous import, and he poured so much energy and soul into resolving it, that by the time his 4-year administration was over, he had aged 20 years. The pictures of him before and after are the pictures of 2 different men. From the beginning, the war was far more than a battle to end slavery, and far more than a struggle to preserve the Union. To Lincoln, the United States was an experiment in a people's ability to govern themselves. If that experiment failed, for the rest of history, monarchs, dictators, and tyrants would use it as an argument against self-rule. To Lincoln, the entire future of democracy was at stake. The Union quickly gathered a large army and set out for the South, its soldiers convinced they could defeat the Confederacy in one battle. But in the very first battle of the war at Bull Run, the Union was defeated. Then it lost the Battle of Manassas. Very quickly, the North realized there would be no quick and easy victories in the fight to save the Union. Through the entire first 2 years of the war, the North faced setback after setback, and Lincoln, deeply frustrated, replaced one general with another. When the Union Army of General George McClellan drove back Robert E. Lee's forces at Antietam, McClellan then held back and refused to chase them. Lincoln sent McClellan a simple telegram: "If you don't want to use the army, I should like to borrow it for a while. Yours respectfully, A. Lincoln." In anguish over his inability to find a general who was aggressive, Lincoln replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside lost the Battle of Fredericksburg and was replaced by General Joseph Hooker. Hooker lost the Battle of Chancellorsville. Nowhere could Lincoln find a man with the willingness and skill to do what his commander-in-chief expected. And then a general with a taste for liquor and cigars, and a reputation for a tough attitude and a quick mind, began to turn the war in a new direction. General Ulysses S. Grant first made headway in the Mississippi Valley, taking Fort Henry and then Fort Donelson. Next he forced a Confederate retreat at Shiloh, sacrificing a large number of his men in the process. As time passed, the tenacity and courage of General Grant became more and more evident, until finally Lincoln put him in charge of the Union forces, and the tide began to change. The management of his army was only one of Lincoln's tasks.